So let's talk about hate speech. Rita, James, you get stuck with some character saying, that's hate speech. How do you respond?
Sorry. I'm just dramatically rolling my eyes in my mind there, because that's how I would react. I would roll my eyes and say, do you value free speech or do you not? Hate speech, your hate speech is someone else's free speech. And unless that speech is instigating violence against an individual or a person, then it's free speech and it should be protected. Thankfully in the US it is, but here we have to fight for it.
Now, James, Rita mentioned this kind of conflict between hate speech and free speech. This is, of course, the lovies, the lefties. This is their automatic default position that if hate speech is more important, that monitoring and policing hate speech is far more important than any airy-fairy concepts of free speech.
Yeah, I mean, look, over the course of my lifetime, I have watched the issue of hate speech flip in fact, censorship all around just flip entirely around, because when I was a kid, the left was all about free speech.
Yep.
It was free speech. It was, it was Lenny Bruce, it was George Carlin, it was right to say dirty words on television, it was right to have your pornography and everything else, and it was the right to be offensive. In the United States, where I grew up, one of the key cases of free speech involved a bunch of Ku Klux Klan guys who wanted to march through an Illinois suburb that had a big Jewish population, and the ACLU, which was the big left-wing civil liberties group, they filed a brief on behalf of the Klan, because they said free speech is so important that even if it involves Klanners marching through a Jewish neighborhood, we have to take the side of free speech. Now you fast forward 40 or 50 years, and here we are. We've got, not just in Australia, but the same thing in the United States. Everybody wants to ban stuff they don't like, and it all comes down to their feelings, And so we're not talking about, saying, oh, you should go out and kill somebody because they're Jewish or they're gay or whatever. We're now literally talking about people having their feelings offended, and we saw this with Israel Folau. And it becomes this whole thing where suddenly, the public square becomes ever smaller and more shrunken because there's so little you can say that somebody isn't going to take offense at.
And hate speech, what constitutes hate speech, is forever growing. Now saying something as simple and factual and based in science as women have wombs or women are women, is considered hate speech by some, because it is trans exclusionary. It's hurtful to certain tiny demographics. So if someone wants to talk to you about hate speech, then I would give them some examples of what in 2020 is considered hate speech, and if they support that, then there's no help for them. You can't help them. Move along. Don't waste your energy.
Yeah. Well, let's go back through the history, if you like. Free speech, as James was saying, as you were saying, it's absolutely enshrined in all concepts of democracy, in America, First Amendment, and so on. This concept that you are only really ever an individual, a free individual. You're only a free person if you're allowed to express yourself freely. Now, this idea runs right back through the French Revolution. Free speech has come up through European history all the time, and the great minds have always settled on the idea that, with the one exception that Rita drew attention to, advocating or calling for the death or violence against another person, that aside, an individual should be absolutely free to express whatever they think, because otherwise someone else is deciding, someone else is governing what they are allowed to think.
And this goes way, way, way back in history to the Enlightenment, and even before. John Milton talked about this in Areopagitica, I believe it was called. John Stuart Mill talks about this. There is a huge, long, long tradition. There is the thing often ascribed to Voltaire, but I don't think he actually said it about, I will defend your right to say it if I don't agree with it, whatever.
I don't agree with what you're saying, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. You're right, it wasn't Voltaire, but it was extracted from kind of things he'd said. And it's an absolutely critical point.
And this was, and Rowan, this was something that the left used to pride itself on. It was always the conservative right fuddy-duddies that they said wanted to clamp down on what people were allowed to say and allowed not to say it. They were the ones who wanted censorship and to want to ban things. And now the left, they're the ones who suddenly realized, hey, hang on, Maybe, and I think what I really think has happened here is that over the course of, say, the last 50, 100 years in the West, so Australia, the United States, Western Europe, the left was really, really, really happy to use free speech so long as they could use it to demolish civil society, institutions, families, and things like that, the church, and just knock power out from everybody else. And then, all that having been done, then they want to say, oh, now we're going to pull that ladder up. We want no free speech anymore because we are in charge and you're not going to say things that we don't like.
Well, this is what happens when you don't fight the culture wars. And the left's march through the institutions is pretty much complete. It's not just education or government sectors. It is right through the corporate world. It is prevalent in so much of our daily life. And yes, they want to make it unacceptable to hold even mainstream conservative views, let alone if you've got some fringe ideas. If you're a mainstream conservative, if you're a part of the majority of Australians, much of what you think and say is considered hate speech.
Let me just, something Rita just said, that the four most dangerous words in the English language these days in the West are you can't say that. And you hear it in office places, you hear it in workplaces, you can't say that. You hear it around family dinner tables. Remember Gillian Triggs, the former human rights?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
She joked, or didn't joke, she said seriously that it was a shame that the Human Rights Organisation couldn't listen to the conversations around the kitchen table. So this idea that you can't say that, and you speak to people, you can't, we used to be able to say that, but you couldn't say that now. Why not? And why aren't the youth of today insisting, yes, I can say that, it is my birthright? Who are you, boss, or who are you, person on the media person, politician, to tell me I can't say it?
Well, and Rita talks about, conservative ideas, but I would say even just ideas that were mainstream and just what everybody thought 10 years ago would be now verboten. Look at
that Martin Luther King speech, the key speech about judging a person based on their character, the contents of the character. That
would be hate speech.
If a white person said it today, they would say that is hate speech because you are cancelling out the lived experience of minorities and oppressed people, and you are normalising white supremacy and white privilege and all sorts of other crazy notions.
But the real danger here, though, the real danger is that this becomes internalized in people's heads, and now, so everybody goes out there self-censoring, and they think, ooh, hang on, I was just going to say something about this, but I'm not so sure about this. I have friends who work in corporate Australia, and they all the time tell me about things where they'll say something and then there'll be an eyebrow raised, and they think, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have said that, and there'll be very innocuous things, but people feel now that, their mortgage is on the line, their career is on the line, and now suddenly their consciousness is owned by HR.
That's right.
What is the end game? If the end game here was by doing this, by clamping down on free speech and having this climate of censorship, that we are a kinder, more inclusive, more tolerant society, then you could at least argue perhaps there's some good in it. That you give up something, but you gain something. But the very people who scream hate speech are typically the most intolerant, hostile,
and
unpleasant,
hateful
individuals. And the very people who do, that's harmful, that's a hurtful thing to say, it's something that's completely
Rita, you're right.
idea.
They would quite happily destroy an individual's career.
Yeah.
They do it all the time. Destroy an individual's career. That person might be married, might have family, kids. The dignity of that individual is trashed simply because they may have made some comment that has been perceived by someone to be offensive, and it is fine to destroy someone's career if in the name of the greater good of a woke society they've made some transgression.
Rowan,
this to me is fascism.
It is absolutely fascism. It is complete totalitarian. You look at the fights intramurally on the left to see where they want all of society to go. Look at how, like in academic world, for example, somebody will be described as a TERF, which is a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. So they are women who are feminists, but they believe that only biological women are women, and they get cancelled. You have even Germaine Greer be at the end of one of these assaults. And, it happens that they get attacked physically, they get their careers destroyed, because the thing is that is so scary about this really hard minority of speech police is they would see anybody who disagrees with them absolutely out in the street starving, and they would look at that and say, good, they are totalitarians. They are the exact same sort of people who would have been enforcers in Mao's China, in Stalin's Russia, and they're here today, and thank God they don't have guns.
And they use the language of tolerance, so that under the guise of things like inclusivity and diversity, they are pushing policies that are anything but harmonious and kind.
It's Orwell.
So
it is.
I keep hoping, I have faith in this, but I hope I'm right, that there will be a generation coming through who will naturally rebel against this, in the same way that the punks rebelled against, soft rock music, in the same way that Elvis, surely, or the Stones, in the same way, surely a generation must come through who laugh at this stuff and go, this is rubbish, we're not having it. Am I overly optimistic, Rita?
Sometimes I think you are with that, but then every now and then I see some Gen Zs and they seem to be a little bit different to their millennial predecessors, where they're already fed up with some of this nonsense. They're fed up with being told, 1 in 3 of you boys is going to grow up to be a rapist. They're fact-checking that now and going, well, that's actually not the case.
Excellent.
But I do wonder whether throughout the education process from preschool to university that indoctrination is going to take hold, and though the signs might be positive now, they're going to submit eventually.
But then you end up with the land, like James is saying, which we've seen it in China, we've seen it in East Germany, other places, Russia, where people are so cowed they don't dare speak up at work, and what a miserable place that would be to live in, James.
Well, yeah, but I do sort of see some signs, some little sparks of brilliance and some green shoots here, I guess, to mix my metaphors, where there are people who are both young and also older, calling out this sort of attempt to define the limits of what is acceptable discourse, whether it's in politics and talking about Trump and or feminism. So there are green shoots, but the problem, as Rita says, is that the education system is so devoted towards pushing this one particular idea. But I also see young people who I know who will say, well, they try and push this stuff and you just go along with it, but then, it's all nonsense.
The big problem is that in terms of education, we've stopped educating kids about how brilliant free speech is and the benefits to society of free speech, and we've allowed this other narrative of this oppressive, it's all hate speech, mustn't say that, to take over from the benefits of free speech.
Well, because they've been spoilt by having this prosperity, having this freedom. You go to Hong Kong, there's no confusion there about the value of free speech, because they can see it's about to be taken from them. So I think part of the problem is we've got generations who have been spoilt.
There you go. Fantastic, Rita and James. That's the Outsider's Guide to Hate Speech and Free Speech. Lots more we could say, and we can say it whenever we like.